Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. At this point, my marketing team suggested a lengthy piece on why more boards should be using Nurole to hire their next chair, non-executive director, trustee, or board advisor. Rather than bore you with that, I'll cut to the chase. We're the market leader now in the board space, doing 1,000 board placements annually, and we focus exclusively on non-executive appointments, giving us deep and current board search expertise. Our members tell us they want more roles. If every person listening now could send just one board role Nurole's way in the next 3 years, opportunities will increase exponentially for everyone. As the saying goes, communities grow great when people plant trees whose shade they will never know. Today's guest, Matthew Newcombe-Ellis, spent 15 years as an investment banker at Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, and latterly Robey Warshaw, where he was one of 4 founding members. In 2016, he joined the board of Prostate Cancer Research. 2 years later, he became chair, a role which he has done full-time for the last 2 years. During that time, Prostate Cancer Research has tripled its income, grown research projects from 4 to 23 across the UK and US, and set up fundraising, risk and audit, and finance subcommittees. In June this year, Matt was appointed trustee at Kidney Research UK and will become chair in March 2024. Matt, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ollie. Great to be here.
Matt, I remember you asking me when you were first considering taking on a chair role, and I can't believe your tenure is now almost over. I remember talking to you about it, and I think I advised you against taking on a chair role alongside a full-time exec job. But you went ahead, although you did end up leaving your full-time job not long after. What advice would you give someone now asking you the same question?
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that those were kind of 2 separate things. So I did do both my full-time role and chairing the charity for 3 years together. And I think it is possible to be the chair of a charity while doing a demanding job. When I think about most of the demands on my time as a chair, it's not often that things are urgent and need responding to immediately. So providing that there's understanding on both sides, I think it's definitely is possible to do a busy job and to chair a charity. But I think the charity needs to understand that you've got your full-time job as well, and there'll be some times where you're less available or you can't make certain meetings. And similarly, I think you need your job to understand that you've taken on this responsibility, and there'll be some times where you have to chair board meetings and things like that. So you need understanding on both sides, but I wouldn't discourage anybody from applying to chair a charity just because they've got a busy job. And in fact, I think actually it can be very additive. It depends on what your job is, but I think my bosses were quite enlightened in that they realized that this would be a great experience for me. The role was advising boards and management teams, so what better way to learn how to advise a board than to chair one? So I think they were quite forward thinking on that.
Makes a lot of sense. We have these sessions with the Nurole community where non-execs come together and discuss some of the challenges that they're wrestling with. And one of the most common topics raised is people thinking about stepping up into the chair role. And the questions they have are both, how do they go about getting a chair role? And then once they've got it, how do they best go about preparing for it? How did you prepare for taking on this chair role, and what helped you most?
Yeah, there were quite a few things that I did and that other people did that were helpful to me. I think the first one I'd say is that Tim, who was the previous chair of Prostate Cancer Research, stayed on as a trustee for a few months after I became chair. So he was available to me as a sounding board and a source of advice. So I think that was helpful. Obviously spent a lot of time with the management team and the CEO in particular, kind of discussing our vision for the charity and what we wanted to do together over the next few years. And there was good alignment there. So I think that was important clarity before taking on the role. And then speaking to people who'd been chairs beforehand. I'm quite fortunate to have lots of mentors from my past roles, and I think they were able to give some advice on, what being a chair entails and how they approach it and how they think through certain problems. You're then in a position to take the best bits from that advice and incorporate it with your own style. Someone talked me through what they called the challenging friend, although I think that was actually a version of critical friend, which is the more established. I like challenging friend. I don't like critical friend because I don't think it's the job of the chair to to criticize the CEO all the time. That's a really difficult job. It's a lonely job, as you'll know as a CEO. And I don't think having someone constantly marking your homework is particularly helpful, dynamic, or motivating for the CEO. So I think challenging friend is, whether it's intentional or unintentional, better way of going about it. And when you build a relationship where there's trust, the CEO knows that if the chair's asking questions, it's because they want to understand or want to help the organization get to a better place. It's not because they think they know better or they think they have all of the answers. So that was a good bit of advice that helped me in my early days as a chair.
Really interesting. One of the things that we see in the data on Nurole's platform is it's something like 10 times easier to hire a trustee than it is a chair. My advice to organizations is you shouldn't be hiring a chair. Ideally, you promote from within, because if you're hiring a chair, it's really hard, especially for these charity chair roles where people are being asked to take on serious risk, a serious time commitment, and they're not getting paid for it. And I do sometimes wonder, why does anyone do this role? What have you enjoyed most about it? For someone sitting there thinking, gosh, why is anyone crazy enough to take on a role like that? What would be your perspective?
I think the obvious thing to say is charities all have a social purpose, and being part of the team that delivers that purpose is very rewarding.
But I guess you could get that as a trustee as well. What is it that's unique about being a chair, given the significantly incremental workload required?
I think you're probably right that the altruistic impact delivering side of it is probably there, whether you're a trustee or a chair. It might be that you feel it slightly more as a chair because of the time commitment and effort that goes into it, but I certainly felt it when I was a trustee as well. So that's maybe not a reason to step up to chair. I think one of the other things that I really enjoy is working with the team, helping them grow and develop. And I think that's maybe something that you do to a greater extent as a chair than you would do as a trustee. Both boards that I'm a part of, the trustees are very engaged outside of trustee meetings and a whole host of different activities. But I think as chair, you just do have more regular dialogue with the senior management team. So I think that's an interesting part of it.
Okay. Now, I'm curious to understand how you've thought about adding value as a chair. The organization has obviously gone from strength to strength under your leadership. Have you framed your way of thinking about the ways that you can add value?
I'd say a few things. Obvious one is chairing the meetings and the governance side of things. So I think we made a big effort to make sure that the charity had the right structures and processes in place to make sure that the trustee board was making effective decisions. That included things like creating subcommittees, which we didn't have previously, so that relevant expert trustees could go into more detail on specific topics outside of the board meetings, so that we could then focus the board meetings on more strategic matters. So that's one thing where I've tried to add value. Another is supporting the management team and giving them the freedom and the flexibility to be innovative. PCR is a relatively small charity, so if we're going to have impact, we need to try new things. Some of those have worked well, others probably need a bit more time or a bit of modification. But I'd like to think I've created an environment amongst the trustee board where the team aren't afraid to try new things, suggest new things. And then maybe also just creating opportunities for the team as individuals. I think as a chair of an organization, people will most often take a meeting. I enjoy reaching out to other organizations in the space, doing that first intro, finding out ways that where we can collaborate, and then handing that off to the management team to build relationships with those other organizations. So that's something that I like to do as a chair that maybe is a bit harder to do as a trustee. As a chair, you're kind of
Can you
more
give
of
me
a figurehead of a charity. Well, you connected me to someone who was the chair of another charity to have a conversation, and that conversation uncovered that there were areas of mutual interest, and it may be that we're funding some research together now collaboratively. So that's maybe something that the management team might not have had the bandwidth to do, or there wasn't that reason for that initial conversation. So it's quite rewarding as a chair to be able to facilitate those things.
Brilliant. And you talked about creating an environment where people felt comfortable innovating. What, practically speaking, have you done to foster that?
Probably comes back to the comments that I made earlier about not being critical and being supportive, even when people come up with ideas that don't eventually play out. You're taking the time to understand the thinking and the rationale behind them. I think it's how you behave in trustee meetings and just how you engage with the team generally, and making sure that we've got the right people around the table in order to so that the team have the right level of expertise to call on and people who can really help guide and shape those ideas into something tangible.
My sense is you've been particularly thoughtful about that composition and the way that you've approached the composition of the board. What have you learned on the journey of your time on this board as chair?
Shortly after I was appointed, we did quite a large recruiting round, which we did through Nurole, as you'll know, and we appointed 5 trustees at the same time, which was quite a large intake. But I would definitely support the idea of, on occasion, hiring multiple people at the same time, because I think it allows you to balance lots of factors together and consider the overall composition of the new trustees as opposed to just continually hiring people sequentially. So that gave us a new body of trustees. And then I think we took a step back and thought, what are the areas where we're missing, or the particular skills where we are missing? Which perspectives don't we have on the board? And we then went and did some very deliberate recruiting for people with those skills. So it's really been a mix, but I'm happy with where we've got to in terms of the skill matrix and covering off the skills that are essential around a trustee table.
Interesting. One of the challenges with hiring a large number of people in one go like that for a board is, one, you run the risk of, in 3 or 6 years or 9 years, whenever their tenure runs out, of having a whole load that you need to replace in one go as well, and you lose huge amounts of experience. The other thing that I think is also sometimes underrated is the value of having different members of your board at different stages in their life cycle. I think someone once explained it to me as, your first 3 years, you're getting up to speed. Your next 3 years, you're adding value. Your last 3 years, you've gone native and are part of the furniture, and you carry the corporate identity with you. But each of those stages has value and offers something different. And it's important to have different members of your board at different stages. And I guess the risk of having brought 5 in one go is they move through those cycles together, and you potentially lose that diversity of perspective of the person who's just coming in asking the stupid question, or the person who, when they all go and you have to replace them again, has the history of the organization. What was your experience of that been? What have there been actually advantages to doing it like that?
I don't really recognize the 3, 3, and 3. Maybe it's more 1, 7, and 1. But I think people have got up to speed pretty quickly. We've taken what I think is quite a thoughtful approach to an induction to try and help people get up that learning curve quicker, although it's inevitable that you'll know more on year 4 than you did at the end of year 1. So I accept that. And I suppose prostate cancer research, I'm in my final 6 months now, and I don't feel like I've checked out. If anything, I feel like I'm having a sprint to the line because I want to squeeze every last drop out of the time that I'm there. So, look, I think, yes, all of those points that you raised about recruiting lots of people at the same time are valid, but I think we'd probably been slow on recruiting prior to that. So we would have a number of people leaving in the coming years. So our choices were hire everyone in one go or kind of continually be hiring someone every 3 months. And I think you're going to get to the same point after 18 months. I would prefer the bulk hire, as it were, for those reasons I gave you earlier about being able to balance the skills and expertise within the group, rather than hiring sequentially. And maybe the things that we'll have to do in terms of staggering exit dates. So some people don't get the full 9 years. And so there's not a kind of another cliff at the end of their tenure. But I tend to find that people have their own reasons as to why they'll drop off. So I'm not sure we'll necessarily get that cliff anyway. It'll probably hopefully naturally resolve itself.
Okay, nice. Now, tell me more about the onboarding process you put in place, because I imagine you've been thoughtful about that, and it must also be interesting for you now going through the onboarding process again as a trustee in a new organization before becoming chair. What have been your lessons?
At PCR, we invite the new trustees to come in for a day and spend the whole day with management. So they get to spend time with each of the senior leaders so they understand how we raise the money, how we spend the money, how we look after our patients, all of the aspects of running the charity. So I think that's really valuable in terms of getting people up to speed quickly and giving them the chance not only to meet the exec directors who they'll probably engage with at the board, but also the people below them and having those relationships. And as you say, I'm going through that same process now with kidney research. I knew very little about kidney disease before I applied for the role. So lots of learning from that perspective, but there are also lots of similarities in terms of things that I've learned from being a trustee and being a chair of a medical research charity that can translate relatively easily over to the new role. What Kidney Research did when they appointed me as chair-elect was that they appointed me as a trustee for a year before the current chair will step down and I will become chair. And that's been invaluable because it's meant that I've had a whole annual cycle of understanding the meetings and events that we have. And so when I'm in a position that I have to chair those next year, I've just got a much better understanding of how it works in that particular setting.
How do you do that on an ongoing basis? One of the things that I quite like to do with my advisory board members is to get them involved in quarterly retrospectives that each of my functional teams do. And we'll typically get the advisory board member who has the functional spike that relates to that team involved in that, because what that enables is them to get a very good sense of what's going on without imposing any reporting burden on my executive team. And it allows them to stay engaged between board meetings, which can sometimes be challenging. So when you come to the board meeting, everything is quite fresh and top of mind for people. Is there a wide variance in the levels of engagement of your different trustees? I know you've talked about in the past some of the differences between those that you've approached versus those who approached you in the way that they engage with the organization.
I think those that approach us often have a personal connection to the disease or the area of focus for the charity. And I think that tends to motivate a certain level of contribution, which I think is potentially harder to generate without that. So I think you probably do see a greater commitment from those who really wanted to be trustees as opposed to those who you've specifically targeted. But I think you should also keep in mind you've often gone to those people for specific skills and expertise, and providing that they are contributing those skills and expertise when you need them, I'm a happy chair and the charity is happy with that level of contribution. So maybe the takeaway is to have a good balance on your board of both.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very striking to us, the contrast between the pro bono roles on the platform and what the organizations typically look for versus the paid roles. And the pro bono ones weight much more highly the reasons for application. And we
Yeah.
sometimes see them discarding candidates who've expressed interest in a role on the basis that they haven't demonstrated enough passion and connection to the organization. Whereas in the paid role space, they almost don't care about the reason for interest and they're just focused on the experience. And I wonder if that goes a little bit to that, how much you can get out of people, that those organizations have recognized that passion is a really significant driver of engagement.
Yeah, no, I think so, because I would worry that over a prolonged period of a trustee tenure, if you don't have that passion, might the end wane. I don't think that would necessarily be the case with everybody, because people have different motivations, and I'm sure for a lot of people, once they've committed to something, they want to do a great job at it. But I think it's a helpful indicator of how engaged someone's going to be. And then also that medical research charities are putting a lot of emphasis at the moment on being patient-centric and making sure that the decisions at the trustee board reflect the requirements of their patient population. And I assume that a similar dynamic goes on in different charitable sectors. So that personal connection that you mentioned is often important, because it means that the people who you're supposed to serve are represented at the board level in your decision making.
Okay. One of the areas that strikes me you've been particularly successful with over your tenure has been fundraising, which is one of the areas we see many charities really struggling with. I'm curious to hear what advice you'd offer to other chairs or those considering taking on a charity chair role around how to think about fundraising. Clearly, given your background, it's an area of expertise in the commercial space, but I imagine some of that has translated into the way that you think about it in this pro bono arena.
One of the first conclusions at PCR was that we were too focused on a narrow number of fundraising streams. We raised a lot of money from events, and we also had some legacy income and an annual fundraising dinner, but that was about it. And that funding is great when you can get it, but there's a limit as to how much you can scale it. There's only so many people that can run the marathon for you, and also there's not very much in the way of diversification. So we invested in our trusts and foundations fundraising, which has been quite successful. We have invested in our corporate relationships, which are predominantly with the pharma industry and people who are working in ancillary industries to the work that we're doing. But those partnerships have been very successful, and it meant that, for example, when the pandemic hit and people weren't allowed to leave their houses and our fundraising dinner was cancelled and the marathon was postponed, we still had some other sources of income that we could fall back on. So I'd say that kind of risk management approach is one thing that's been quite important. Maybe the second thing to add is that we've really tried to make sure that when we're putting fundraising proposals in front of people, they see the value of the solutions that we're delivering. And it's not just asking people to give to us because we're nice guys, because it ticks a box for them from a CSR perspective. So really trying to make it more of a partnership with the people who are giving to us and less of a transactional relationship. And then maybe just one final thing, which you and I have spoken about before, is I still think high net worth giving and philanthropy is important for charities. And, maybe it's somewhat inconsistent with my previous comment that we need to focus on demonstrating impact, but it does help to have high net worth people around the board table, around your fundraising efforts, so that they can bring in other people who are able to make those 6-7 figure donations that can really transform individual projects and move those forward.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a contrast with what you see in the US, where essentially it's pay to play. Sit on the board and you're there because of the donations you make or that you bring in. Whereas typically UK charities are usually people there based on the skills and experience and perspective that they bring. Do you think there's a case for a mix of the two, or more of a mix of the two than we currently have?
Yeah, I really don't like the pay to play model because I think it contrasts with governance requirements. But I think if you can find people who are experts and passionate about your cause and also happen to be high net worth or have high net worth networks, then that can be a really valuable thing. And those people aren't particularly common, but if you can find them, then they're worth their weight in gold. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on that high net worth network as a criteria alongside the other skills that you're looking for on a board.
So if someone's sitting there listening to this thinking, ooh, I better start thinking about how I build that network, any tips on how you have gone about doing that?
I want to paint myself as an expert in that area because I think it's probably still a nut that we've not cracked. But I think, as with any fundraising effort, the more people you tell your story to, it might not work for the first conversation, it might not work for the second conversation, but by the time you're on the third or fourth connection, you find someone who fits the criteria and also cares about what you're doing. So I think the thing that we always have to do is have as many conversations that you can. And the sad thing about cancer or kidney disease is that there are lots of people out there who have been touched by these things personally. I can't keep count of the number of times that you tell people about your role and they tell you a personal story for them. So, for some people it stops there, but for others, they're more interested. And then that can lead on to a bigger partnership with them.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the other side of the coin around the biggest challenges that you faced as a first time chair. If someone's listening to this and they want to make sure that they go in eyes wide open to what they're letting themselves in for, what would you say were the biggest challenges for you?
I think the challenges for me have all been from things that we weren't expecting and that weren't in the plan. The obvious example is COVID, where we lost half of our income, and that required a lot of hands-on chairing and being flexible and making decisions and making sure we looked after our staff and making sure that we took an approach to funding research that didn't reduce the long-term capacity. I think some charities had to cut the research that they were funding, and that has consequences down the line. Being a chair would be easy if you were able to just come up with a strategy and deliver the plan without any unexpected hiccups, but it isn't like that. So those unexpected situations that require a lot of time and focus and where there's not a clear answer, I'd probably say that's the most challenging thing. Obviously, people need to be, especially people who've come from the corporate sector, need to appreciate that it'll be different, and often there aren't the same level of resources available that there would be at a large corporate. But I think our mentality as a charity has been maybe closer to a startup, and you can innovate and do things in a different way, and you try and turn that weakness to a strength.
You obviously came from a financial background, but you didn't have the sector knowledge as such.
Yeah.
People often say they want a chair who's got sector knowledge. Did you feel that was ever a blind spot? How much of a help was the financial expertise? Someone listening to this who didn't have the financial expertise, say, how much of a challenge do you think that would be? And were there other blind spots that you felt?
It's definitely an area where I needed to learn and spend time quickly, because I think it's really hard to chair an organization if you don't understand the context in which they're operating. And so, one, are you willing to put in the time to to get up the curve? 2, have you got people around the table who can help you with making decisions on things where you're not expert? But I suspect it's pretty unlikely that a lot of charities will be able to find someone who ticks every single box. But I think you do need to be able to demonstrate an interest in the subject matter and a willingness to learn.
Definitely. I mean, most charities looking for a chair are struggling to find them. So if they get 1 or 2 people interested, they are really pleased. So if people are interested, they should be putting themselves forward for these roles because they've got a really good chance of getting them, given the sort of competitive dynamics versus, say, a non-executive role or a trustee. If I had your trustees and the exec team with me now on this call and you weren't there, what will they say you've done well? And where will they say you need to work on to be even better as a chair in your next role?
I think I can give you quite a good answer to this one because I've recently just had a round of conversations with my trustees at Prostate Cancer Research in light of the fact that I'll be stepping down in March. And interestingly, one of the comments that came up in nearly all of the conversations was that it was clear that I had a very strong relationship with the CEO. So I think that's probably a strength. And then one thing that I've been thinking about as my tenure comes to an end is that I've probably not done a very good job with people who've left the board over the years. Obviously we say some nice words at the end of the trustee meeting, but I think on reflection, that's probably not enough. And one thing I would certainly like is to stay involved and feel close to the charity that I've given 8 years to, and a lot of the initiatives that I've been part of the trustee board, they'll come to fruition after I've stepped down as a chair, but I'd still really like to know how that all unfolds. So yeah, one thing I'd like to do better is more of a ongoing relationship with people who've made a significant contribution to the charity. I suppose a bit like an alumni network. I know our mutual former employer does a good job of that. So I think it's just it's another thing to do, and it takes time and effort, but I think it's important for the people who've given a lot to the organisation.
Yeah, I love that. It's always very difficult as an organisation in general, even when you have executive people leaving, knowing how to keep them connected and ensure that you can continue to give and potentially get some value from them that makes you sort of collectively stronger. It's a really interesting idea. I haven't thought about that so much in the space of non-execs and trustees. You've got amazing people there who still care deeply about you as an organisation, who maybe not there in the day-to-day, but could still add lots of value. What else have you learned from your chair experience that would have been helpful to know before?
It probably took me a bit of time to get up to speed on the subtleties of chairing a meeting versus just participating in a meeting. If you're chairing, you'd need to be fully focused the whole time, listening to what people are saying, listening to what people aren't saying, observing.
Does that mean
body.
when you're not chair?
I think, but there are times where you can drift off and check your phone or whatever. When I chaired a meeting, I'm exhausted. It requires a real effort. So I don't think I'd appreciated that before I took on the role, and now I have learned that. I think there are things that I can do that make that easier.
So tell me about those. What do you do?
Yeah, I tried to do a dry run of the meeting in my own head and kind of think about, okay, on agenda item X, whose voices do I want to hear from, particularly who was vocal on this the last time, who's participated to a lesser degree in recent meetings. If I'm being really good, I'll let them know in advance that I'd like to come to them during the meeting so that they can prepare and be ready for that. I wouldn't want to give the impression that board meetings are entirely choreographed, because I don't think that's a productive use of time. But I think just having clarity on how you want things to unfold means that you can be more present in the discussion.
You're really interesting. I mean, that's something I spend lots of time thinking about with my senior leadership as at meetings as an executive of how we approach agenda items and tackle them, and try to think about for each agenda item how we're going to tackle that problem. So spending time, for example, thinking about what is the problem. And there's often the temptation for people to jump onto the solutions first, but being really clear, no, at this stage, we're just thinking about what's the underlying problem. And then at this stage, we're just thinking about, well, what are our options? And then at this stage, we're thinking, okay, let's start narrowing down those options. And you get those who are better at divergent thinking, tending to shine during those sort of open-ended conversations, and those who are better at convergent thinking, shining more in the closed parts. How do you think about that dynamic? Do you have any mental models or frameworks that you use for structuring those discussions so that, as you say, you get that balance right between not choreographing but ensuring that you make the most of the time and the talent around the table?
I think one thing is being really clear in advance of the meeting what the purpose of each agenda item is. Is it for discussion? Is it for a decision? If so, what's the decision? So that I think then when trustees or directors are doing their own preparation for the meeting, they know what's being asked of them. I found that really helpful.
And when you have an item that's for discussion, I don't know whether there's an example that springs to mind. Sometimes when I see that on agendas, my eyes roll because I think, well, what is the point of a discussion? there's surely an end goal
Yes.
here. What are we trying to get to from that discussion? Is it about just making sure everyone is up to speed? Is it about identifying what the options that we have are? How do you frame that?
I agree with you. I think for information or it's for decision, being vague in terms of just general discussion isn't particularly helpful to anybody. So yeah, I think the more concrete you can be about the objective, the better.
And how often would you try to encourage the executive to lay out options and really have thought through those different options and provide a clear recommendation versus do you have times when you encourage them to come with a blank sheet of paper where you work at it as a board? There's a risk of that in my experience, that you end up with the complete sort of dog's dinner as people go off in different directions if there's not enough structure.
Yeah, so I felt quite strongly when I took over as chair that agenda items, in the most part, required a recommendation of the management team because they are the people who are living and breathing this 9 to 5. And the trustees can come to a meeting and then not necessarily engage at all for another 3 months. So handing over the responsibility for making those decisions to trustees, I don't think is optimal. My preference has always been for management to come to meetings with a clear recommendation. Now that recommendation can be challenged, and management can say, in reaching this recommendation, we also considered A, B, C, and ruled them out for X, Y, Z. I think that's a good discussion, but I think just to have a kind of complete open book, as you say, is quite high risk, and especially if you've got a large board, quite difficult to contain and guide towards any firm conclusions. Maybe the exception to that is maybe some of the early kind of strategy setting discussions. So maybe there it's more helpful to have a bit more of an open discussion, at least initially, to give some guidance. But again, I think it needs a framework rather than just let us know what you think. I think that would be difficult.
Okay. Now, for anyone listening to this thinking about taking on a chair role themselves, looking at a particular non-profit where they're interested, would you give them any advice? And I guess you, now with both of your roles, have been a trustee first before taking on the chair role, which I imagine is quite helpful because it means you don't have to do a load of due diligence. You understand a lot about the way things work. But if someone's coming at it cold, what questions should they be asking?
I would focus on 3 areas. The first one would be the CEO and your relationship with them. Can you see yourself working with this person? Because you're going to be working with them a lot over the next 6, 9 years, however long the period is. Is that someone you respect? Is that someone you can trust? I feel fortunate that I've got two very good chief executives who I get on well with and work well with. But I think if that wasn't in place, I'd be nervous about taking on a chair role. So I think that would be the first one.
Nervous? Does
Uh,
that mean you wouldn't take on a chair role?
Absolutely. I think if that relationship isn't right, you're heading for trouble. So spend some time on it, get to know the person, get to know them personally, and think really carefully about how happy you are to be speaking to them on a daily basis for the next 6, 9 years.
But I guess you have the option as chair to change them out. If you care about the organisation significantly, that's always an option you have. Or would you just not cancel, I guess, particularly for a first chair role? And that's going to be a tough
Yeah,
one to take on.
I think that's a challenge to go into a chair role thinking that one of the things that needs to happen is to change the CEO. I probably wouldn't advise that.
Yeah, and I
But
guess actually by the same token, I have heard of chairs who've gone in and CEO has announced 2 weeks after they settle in, and by the way, I'm going to be heading off. So probably another thing you want to be quite sure of, especially if it's your first chair role, is that CEO is going to be sticking around for a while, because that's quite a terrifying position to be in as a new chair, having to bring
yeah,
in a new CEO at the same time.
yeah, because I think you run the risk there of losing institutional knowledge. I think the second thing, and it's probably harder to gauge if you're coming in cold, but is the kind of board culture. Are trustees, do they work together well as a team? Do people want to get to the right decisions for good reasons, or are they there because it looks good on their CV, or they like to tell other people what they think, or the kind of wrong reasons for being a trustee? Maybe harder to gauge without attending a trustee meeting directly, but I think you'd probably get a sense from the interview panel. I'm sure you can take references from people who've been there as well. So I think it's worth doing your homework on that. And then I think the third thing is, something you have to ask yourself, which is it something that you really feel passionate about? You're going to spend a lot of time doing it, and there will be some difficult moments. So if you don't, then maybe it's not a good thing to commit to. But I think if you can
So
tick
how
those,
did you know you felt passionate about the two charities you've been involved with when you don't have a family connection to either?
it's a good question. With my first experience at Prostate Cancer Research, I'd at least been a trustee for 2 years. So I knew at that point that it was something that I felt strongly about because my actions had demonstrated it. You finish a busy day of your day job and then you sit down and read board papers for another couple of hours. You don't do that if you don't feel strongly about it. And I think if the charity is doing a good job with its trustees, it will create opportunities for them to feel a part of the work, whether it's hosting a lab tour where you get to go and see some of the work that's being funded, or an opportunity to engage with patients and hear their stories firsthand. Some of those things are incredibly powerful. So when you've done some of those things, that it's a cause that you feel strongly about. So again, a bit harder to judge from the outside looking in.
But when you first stepped into that trustee role, what gave you the confidence to take that leap of faith again when you didn't necessarily have from the outside an obvious passion for it? Was it just a leap of faith? Because I always encourage people, if they're taking on pro bono roles, to only do it in something that they are passionate about, because as you say, when things go wrong, they can consume huge amounts of time, and if you're not passionate about it, and to be fair, it's the same with paid roles as well. I remember getting a hospital pass earlier on in my career, and I got one of my first roles as an investor on a board, and it went straight into a restructuring. And it was all right because it was part of my paid role, and it was a great learning experience. But had I been doing that as a non-exec, that would have been horrendous. How did you know from the outside that you were passionate,
Yeah, well,
or that you would become passionate?
I think there was the kind of obvious logical step that charity raises money, charity spends money in a way that's consistent with its charitable purpose. That helps people who have cancer. It doesn't take a genius to kind of work out that that's a good thing and, could be satisfying. Personally, I also quite liked the intellectual side of funding the research and just getting stuck into why do these researchers think this is a good idea and how are they going to test that, and then what are they going to do when they've got the results of that. So I found it intellectually challenging as well.
The time has flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, if you're ready, where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response.
Ready as I'll ever be.
So first up, best book every board member should read and why?
Reboot by Jason Stockwood, which is a blueprint for running a business in the digital age and challenges some conventional thinking about shareholder primacy and hierarchical leadership. Jason's a successful businessman, and 3 years ago he bought my beloved Grimsby town. So I read his book to learn about our new owner, and I don't think you could ask for a better chairman, so we're in safe hands.
Fantastic. Don't know that one. I'll have to look it up. Favourite quote and why?
You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, by Wayne Gretzky, who was the Canadian ice hockey player. But I think it's appropriate for medical research charities because we get dozens of applications every year and we can only fund a fraction of them. And, each one is an opportunity to learn more about a disease and find a potential diagnostic or treatment. So I think it's motivating to think that, we need to have as many shots on goal as possible.
Love that one. Your worst professional advice you've ever received?
Can I include you telling me not to take the chair role?
Absolutely. What 3 things should our listeners take away from this podcast if they take nothing else away?
I would wholeheartedly encourage people to take a chair role if that's something that they're interested in doing, providing, 1, they've got the time to do so, 2, they've got a good relationship with the chief exec, and 3, that it's something that they care passionately about.
Brilliant. Matt, thank you so much. That has been a real pleasure and just amazing to sort of see your journey and hear about it now again, having seen it from the start. And I think that's going to be so helpful for all those listening to this, thinking about potentially embarking on the same journey themselves, or perhaps already on that journey and taking some of the insights and wisdom that you've shared there. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Ollie. And if anyone wants to talk more, they can reach you and you can connect them to me.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.